Over in Scotland, they're perhaps planning to introduce a new tax band for higher earners. This is because they reckon there's a black hole basically in Scotland's finances. Some have put a figure on it at about £500 million. Over in Scotland, they've already got a tax system that's more complicated than the one in England. They've got additional bands already. But as a principle, where are you on this, Matt?
I don't think it's the right move, and I don't think it's the right move for Scotland, by the way. The underlying story is basically, I think, a government that's been struggling to run Scotland and pay for public services. We've seen over the last week a number of big business organisations, rightfully in my view, come out and say, firstly, the numbers don't add up on this. It's not going to generate as much revenue as the Scottish First Minister has claimed. And secondly, it's going to encourage a lot of people to move south into England, where already, were they living in England, they'd be paying less tax. Now, this is actually what we saw ahead of the 2019 general election, when a lot of people were getting ready for what they feared would be a Jeremy Corbyn government. We saw a lot of high earners, a lot of more affluent individuals planning to essentially relocate their assets elsewhere or leave the country. So no, I don't think this is the right move for Scotland at all.
Do you, Aaron?
As a point of principle, I think basically anybody earning less than 100,000 shouldn't be paying more in income tax. I think there are so many places you can collect more money. Capital gains, I think, should be higher. You want to equalise it with wealth, because, of course, the very wealthiest people make money through capital. And so I think, taxing incomes is not necessarily the smartest thing to do. I actually think Labour in the last election made a big mistake there. They should have just said, look, if you're on less than 100k, you won't be paying a penny more. I think somebody on, say, 75k having to pay more...
Why is 100k your magic figure?
Just an arbitrary number. It's quite a lot of money, isn't it, realistically? I think somebody on 75,000 having to pay more income tax, that person has probably seen their mortgage go up, energy bills, food, council tax. Although I should say, in the SNP's defence, they are doing this partly because they want to freeze council tax. And, of course, in England, council tax went up last year. And in addition to that, of course, in Scotland, they don't have university tuition fees. And in my paycheck, quite a lot goes out actually in that. And what's catastrophic with regards to this, and this is probably something that maybe if you're a little bit older, you're not aware of, post-2012 student loans were RPI plus 3%. Of course, RPI last year was about 13%. Such a daft way of financing student loans. So people were looking at basically credit card debt style interest rates. Of course, the government had to cap it at about 7-8%. So that isn't in Scotland either. However, on principle, I think raising income tax is not the smartest thing to do. They would respond, well, where else are we going to get the money from?
And you'd say capital gains?
Yeah, but they would. I suppose they can't. That probably isn't a competence they have. Let
me ask you this, and don't get offended when I ask this question at home, because you go, oh, Michelle, what are you doing? Why are you putting ideas into people's heads? That's it. I'm never going to watch a programme ever again. But a lot of people's primary residence have increased massively. And, of course, the capital gain there is completely tax-free. Should it be?
It's such a hard one. I think, again, in principle, you think it should be. It's a home. I get that. But then sometimes the numbers are so astronomical and people are being hit in so many other places. I see the argument for it. I think we really need a big rethink on capital gains. If it was me, I'd reduce VAT to about 15%. I'd probably get rid of a bunch of exemptions except food. And I'd, bring up capital gains. I know,
But would you apply it to primary residence? That's my question.
I think you look at some of the homes being sold in places like London, you think there's a really strong argument for it. And then you've got places like Blackpool really struggling. We talked about it earlier on. So that is an important redistribution of wealth from London to parts of the country that really need it. But again, it's one of those, I can understand it's your home. I totally get it. On this, though, it's just to finish, because I've said a lot, it's just like inheritance tax. The very wealthiest people, they don't pay it. So the idea that, oh, well, we'll tax the rich, it's a little bit more complicated than that. That's why I'd rather increase capital gains.
There is, just briefly on that, there is an interesting broader point here, which is how Scotland is governed, right? And if you look at the polling, you look at what's going to happen at the election next year, which I think will see a big Labour resurgence in Scotland. I think the SNP are clearly struggling. I think Humza Yousaf is clearly struggling in the polls. But the proposition that Scotland can thrive and prosper independent from the rest of the UK, I don't think is plausible anymore.
Why?
Firstly, it just doesn't have enough money. It's too reliant on the rest of the UK for fiscal transfers. It doesn't have the growth. It doesn't have the dynamism. To be honest, it doesn't really have the leadership that it needs. And I think in this post-Brexit era, where we've seen lots of voters have, rightly or wrongly concluded that whether you voted Leave or Remain, the process was prolonged and difficult. I think this is just going to add to this sense in Scotland that independence is just not really a serious, viable proposition.
But a lot of supporters of independent Scotland will say, well, actually, yes, we want to be independent from the UK, but we want to be part of the EU again.
Yeah, but I mean, firstly, whether the EU is even going to allow that to happen, given other tensions in Spain and other parts of Europe, giving a green light to separatists, I don't think is in the EU's interest. I think, secondly, that's a long process. I think adjusting Scotland, presumably, to adopt the euro and all the rest of it, I think is going to be a very difficult situation. But fundamentally, in terms of, is Scotland a viable economic proposition, an independent Scotland, I think this is another example of why it isn't, actually. The SNP have been struggling not just with tax, Michelle, but just to run schools, run the NHS,
this is very
run
true.
basic public services. If you compare the quality of public services in places like Scotland, Wales versus England, people living there are having a very different, often worse experience than their counterparts in England.
Well, yeah, they've been struggling with a lot of stuff, not least to define clearly what a woman is, but don't get me started on that one.